This is part 2 of my project on creating vision inclusive designs for information visualization. In part 2, I will go over color choice, accessible color choice, magnification, creating alt text, assessing your designs, looking towards the future, and some helpful resources for anyone who wants to learn more. So when choosing colors for your information visualizations, it's very tempting to just use the colorblind palette provided by programs like R, Tableau. Most visualization programs have a colorblind palette. However, those palettes often exclude users with less common forms of color deficiency, and they're really only optimized most of the time for red-green color blindness. So instead, it's much more helpful to design with the possibility that people will view your visualizations completely in grayscale, and that means not to rely on color alone. So you can see from these two palettes, these are the actual colorblind palettes taken from Tableau. The one on the top is how Tableau presents it, and the image on the bottom is how someone who has a stronger um, color deficiency would see it. And as I'm sure you can tell, it's very hard to distinguish between many of these colors. And so this would not be useful for someone who has a stronger color deficiency. So you shouldn't rely on only color alone to get across information. And furthermore, one of the reasons that this is difficult to distinguish the colors is because many of them have very low contrast. And in accessible color design, contrast is key. Having high contrast is very important. So the W3C actually has accessibility standards specifically about contrast. Large scale text against a background should have a 3:1 contrast ratio, and normal and small text against the background should have at least 4.5:1 ratio. I have a tool that I will show you later in this presentation about how you can easily check the contrast ratios of your designs. And keep in mind that this is a really important topic, especially for information visualization designs, because so often color for information visualization is not just a design choice, but it's actually used to show data in some type of way. And so having poor color choice is not only a design problem, but then it means that people cannot fully understand what the data is saying, which is the entire point of information and data visualization in the first place. You can encode information with additional features besides color, right? That's the point, is to not use color. Of course, you should use colors in your designs, however you see fit, but adding on top of that, having some additional features will make it more accessible. Probably the most important of these and the most useful is direct labeling. You can also, in smaller and simpler static graphics, use things like patterns and shapes, so long as they're not like visually overwhelming. Especially this is good for like non-interactive like information, like infographics, let's say. Patterns and shapes can be useful tools. Also, having high contrast borders or white space around colored areas can make them more accessible for people who can't distinguish the colors. Having the border shows where one color ends and another one begins. This is especially important if you think of like a stacked bar chart. You should have some small border between the different colors within each bar. Examples of these design principles. You can see here, this is a typical like simplified version of a line chart, and it might be easy for you to distinguish which line is which based on the legend if you have full color vision. However, looking on the right image, it then becomes much harder to distinguish which label goes with which line, which is why direct labeling is so helpful and so important. Many programs like Tableau, for example, allow, like, by default, they have direct labeling, so that's, really great. But if you're making visualizations outside of those kind of programs, it's something to really keep in mind. And then you can see the impact of having borders around colors. This is the normal colored image, and then in the grayscale image, you can see, at least for me, just that small change of having an outline around each color or a border around the different colors makes it so much easier for me to distinguish where one color ends and another one begins. It's a very small thing you can do that has a really helpful impact. Moving on to magnification and zoom. Designs that allow users to zoom into details are, of course, more accessible for many low vision users. Users who use magnification tools, things like that, like myself. It's really helpful to be able to zoom in or magnify designs. However, again, going back to the principles of inclusive design, interactive designs are better for everyone. So having designs that you can zoom in on and go into detail, that's just a general design principle for all visualizations. So, again, improving access for disabled users can improve the overall experience for everyone. These things go hand in hand. Getting into like more specific information, scale vector graphs, using them are very helpful tools because they allow for zoom and magnification. You can optimize images for dark mode or like inverted screen color, which I use a lot. And they're also really good for working with alt text. They have a lot of functionality for alt text, especially when you're putting your visualizations onto the web. That leads us to what is alt text. Alt text allows screen readers to read out a written description of an image. So someone who has a very severe visual impairment or total blindness probably is using a program that's completely controlled by their keyboard. They don't use a mouse instead, or a cursor, they just use their keyboard to navigate around the screen, and the program reads out everything that's on the screen for them. This is really, really a key tool for allowing blind users to interact with data visualizations in any meaningful way. So just as like a little example, this picture here, my cat, like how would you label this? Many times on the web, when you come across this image, it will just be labeled image. The alt text will just be image or cat. But something more useful would be to say, for example, a close-up of a black cat sleeping with his tongue sticking out. This can give a blind user the feeling of an image and allows them to have a more natural interaction with the design and more meaningful as well. And this is really important because in 2020, there was a study that looked at over 7,000 visualizations that had been shared across Twitter. The study found that only 3% had any alt text whatsoever, and of those 3%, 84% only said image. Obviously, that is not helpful at all, and it's very concerning that as recently as 2021, there was such a lack of inclusivity in visualization images. So how can you create useful alt text for your visualization? It can include things like the type of plot being shown, descriptions that convey the meaning of the data or what this data is showing, variables included on the axes and the scale of the axes. Of course, this works best with static graphs, not with interactive graphs, but we can look at the example here. A graph from the New York Times, and the alt text here reads, bar chart of gun murders per 100,000 people, where America's murder rate is 6 times worse than Canada and 30 times Australia. So the reason that this is a useful alt text is that it shows the story that the data is telling, right? You could also add to this some more civic information about like the scale of the data, but it's a good place to start, especially like primarily the focus should be on what does this data show? What is the story behind this data? And you should definitely include the link to access a table of the original data that you use to create your visualization whenever possible, because people who use screen readers can download that information and then they are able to access the data in that table, and they're able to then read it with their screen reader, and it makes it much more inclusive for them. Let's talk about alt text for interactive graphs. This is a really important topic because, as we have discussed all semester in our course, interaction is a really foundational principle in information visualization design. So how can we include alt text in that? There's a really helpful guide that I'll provide a link to at the end of this that shows how to use ARIA in visualizations. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a W3C standard that allows for interactive compatibility with screen readers. So if you have your visualization anywhere on the web and it's coded with these ARIA standards, then people who use screen readers will be able to navigate through your visualization using that. They can then access the direct labels and then have a much more meaningful interaction with your graph or your visualization. So what's also nice about it is that you can encode the alt text to include directions for how to utilize the interactive features. So in this example, in this image here, it says, part alt text says, use left and right arrows to access single data points, press tab to exit, etc. That's really great that you can actually include the instructions for screen reader users. Of course, this is a relatively simple design, and more complex, more complicated types of visualizations, it's not necessarily compatible with screen readers, and that's something that is definitely a target of future research on how we can get really, complex cutting edge visualizations to be compatible for people using screen readers. If you want to assess your designs to see how accessible they are or how inclusive they are, there's a number of tools that you can use. So tools exist to check the contrast. As you can see in this image here, this is a website where you just put in the two colors and it tells you the exact contrast score, and you can see if it passes the accessibility standards or not. There's also websites that allow you to simulate different types of color deficiencies, so you can upload an image of your visualization and see what would this look like to someone with different types of color deficiency. You can also try using a screen reader for yourself and see what is the experience like. Chartability is a set of standards that are specifically designed to audit accessibility of data visualizations. So again, I will link to that. And I think the most important and most useful is to have inclusive user testing whenever possible. If you know someone who has a visual impairment and they would be willing to look at your design, show it to them, and immediately we will tell you right away what are the accessibility issues, because obviously we've been dealing with this our entire lives. So we know what does and does not work in a design. And so, whenever possible, just reach out to people who will be willing to look at your designs and have inclusive user testing. It really is the best way to improve and ensure the accessibility of your designs. You can also follow the work of different visually impaired visualization designers. There are a number of people in this field who are doing really great work, and I'll link to some of them in the resources. If you follow what they're doing, they're, again, because it's their lived experience, they're going to have the best tips and the best information for you to follow. Looking towards the future, it's important that we continue to raise awareness on why we need to include accessible design. We also need to prioritize setting industry standards specifically for the information and visualization industry. It's 2024 and there are still no widely accepted industry standards. That's a huge issue that should be solved as soon as possible. And people will continue to work on fully integrating accessibility into interactive and more complex and cutting edge visualizations. This is really important. And then one other last thing that I wanted to share that was very intriguing to me is sonic data. This is not a visualization per se because it's using sound, it's presenting data using sound, but it definitely can be integrated into data stories. So if you're a data journalist or you're creating a data story for whatever reason, and you have a way that you could include sonic data or sound into your design, that's automatically going to make it more inclusive for people with visual impairments. There's a really interesting podcast, it's called Loud Numbers Podcast, and they create sonic data soundscapes, sonic data recordings. An example of this is called Hold the Line, where they created sound art based on Canada's 2023 wildfire season, and it included like a whole host of different data points, and so you can see like how many different variables they were able to encode into the design just using sound. It's very fascinating to me, so I linked to that podcast episode if you want to check it out. Finally, I wanted to present some tools and guidelines in one place. I'll also have this linked all on the website. But as you can see, there is a lot of information out there. There are a lot of tools out there just waiting to be used, and unfortunately, not enough people are using them at the moment. So there's guidelines specifically for something called HighCharts, which has a lot of accessibility features, Tableau, D3. The DataVis Ally GitHub resource list, this is, I think, like probably the most useful place to start because it's a great list with so many resources. You can use it. And then I included some podcasts that you might want to listen to if you want to hear from industry professionals who are working on the cutting edge of this issue. For my final thoughts on this topic, I wanted to return to the same article that I quoted from in the beginning of part 1, A New Vision for Data Viz Accessibility article, because I think it has a really great framing of this topic. Quote, "We need to talk about where to go from here, and there's a lot of exciting stuff on the horizon. But first, let's establish responsibility, not in the finger-pointing sense, but in the communal sense. Accessibility is a big, heavy societal issue, and we're collectively responsible for it, even though none of us individually set out to intentionally exclude our neighbors. But we can, actively start thinking about this problem. We have to establish and agree that moving the needle on accessibility is a priority. If we change our mindset, individually and collectively, then the skills and innovation will follow." I thought, that was a nice way to end things. We can all work together on improving accessibility in data visualization, and I sincerely hope that you will give that some consideration. And thank you for listening to what I have to say about this topic.